Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new type of episode that I'm trying out on my channel. This is something that I wanted to try out specifically for this month because during this month, I'm going to be participating in 31 Days of Halloween, where I'm trying to watch a different horror movie every single day of the month. And I thought I would do weekly recaps of all the different movies that I watched in a specific week. This is, of course, the recap for week one. And I thought it would be much easier to try it out like this than doing the regular camera setup with the lighting and, of course, all the editing I have to do and all of those things. I thought that this would just be a way for me to get it out quicker, get it out faster, and it's going to be a lot less hassle for me. So, without further ado, let's get into the movies that I watched during the first week of October. On October 1st, I watched Dead Ringers, which is directed by David Cronenberg and stars Jeremy Irons and came out in 1988. And I wanted to watch this because I am a big fan of David Cronenberg's work. I haven't seen all of his films, but I've seen a good chunk of them. And his early films are very different than his modern day films. And his 1980s films are really the ones that he's most well known for typically. His early stuff is a little bit more difficult to find, but you can find it. But this is more kind of like his midway stuff, right before he gets into the 90s. This film came out right after he did The Fly, which starred Jeff Goldblum, and just has great special effects when it comes to practical makeup effects. It's a really dirty, like gory movie, and this film I thought was going to be a little bit similar because he is someone who utilized a lot of body horror in his movies, and this wasn't the case. This was more of a psychological drama in which Jeremy Irons played identical twin brothers who were both gynecologists, who were both well-known gynecologists, but they were into more things like surgery and reinvigorate and about helping women who had fertilization problems and things like that. And what is interesting about I mean, I meant fertility problems. And what is interesting about this film is that it gets more engrossing and more weird and more psychological as it goes along. And I wasn't anticipating it, but it is a very good movie. I really liked Jeremy Irons in it. I thought it was some of the best acting I've ever seen from him. I haven't seen all of the films that he is in, but I've seen a couple of them, and this has got to be one of his best performances that I've ever seen. And the so I would definitely give this film a high recommendation. I did give it a 4 out of 5, so it's definitely a film that I think is worth watching, especially if you're a fan of David Cronenberg. And also, if you're a fan of kind of 1980s films in general, I do recommend it. The next film I watched was something that was rather different, and it's a film that I actually hadn't heard of until very recently, and that was The Devils, which is a film that is directed by Ken Russell, who was a British filmmaker working a lot in the 1960s and 1970s, part of that British cinematic movement that was very interesting at that time. And this is a film that is rather controversial. It is a film that I believe was banned in several countries after it came out. It's a film that is a dramatization of the account of the rise and fall of a priest named Urban Grandier in the 17th century Roman Catholic Church. And it's a film that very much sensationalizes religion and really shows how crazy religion can get if you take it too far. It's a film that shows the negative impact that has had in our society and in our history. And of course, it's a film that takes a lot of dramatic license. It's also a film that deals a lot with sexual promiscuity, sexual desire. There's a lot of debauchery in it. It's very similar a la Caligula. If you're familiar with Caligula, it's not quite that raunchy, but I found myself kind of comparing it to it because of the subject matter. The film starred Oliver Reed. Oliver Reed, many of you are probably familiar with. He was in the movie Gladiator. That was his last film that he was in. He actually died during that production, and they had to replace him with body doubles and CGI and stuff like that. The film also stars Vanessa Redgrave, who plays this sexually repressed nun who accuses this priest of sexual impropriety, which kind of it starts a chain reaction of this priest ending up being on trial and all of those things. It's actually based on history, so none of it's really a spoiler. It's just the film itself, the way it approaches the subject matter, I thought was just fantastic. It's a film that was way ahead of its time when it came to subject matter. Like, I was really surprised to see a film to come out in the early 1970s to be this debaucherous and to be this graphic. It's fantastic. It is very like psychological and surreal at times, and it's a film that, like I said, really doesn't hold anything back. I personally gave it a 4.5 out of 5 stars. It's my type of movie, a film that is just ambitious and ballsy and just goes for it in all of its aspects. The next film that I watched, which would be October 3rd, was a Japanese horror film that perhaps many of you are familiar with, and that is Ju-on uh, The Grudge. This is the film that the American film called The Grudge is a remake of. And I found myself buying this movie on DVD years ago, but it took me a few years to finally watch it. It took me up until now. And it's a very interesting film, extremely atmospheric, not so much scary, at least for me. I didn't find it to be that scary. It utilized a lot of the same type of um, horror dynamics or some type of like horror scene setups over and over again. And by the time it got towards the end, I'm like, okay, I know what's going to happen. A very creepy thing is going to start crawling out of somewhere, making some weird noises and all of those things. But overall, I really found myself enjoying the movie. I really do highly recommend it for horror fans. Don't be afraid of foreign films when it comes to the horror genre, because they're doing a lot of interesting things out there, and they take more chances than American horror films can. Also, this film, I found out, is actually the third in the series of Grudge films. And the entire series actually has 13 movies, which I thought was very interesting. I didn't realize there were that many Japanese Grudge films. If you're curious, I gave the film a 3.5 out of 5 stars. It's around there for me. I saw some people on Letterboxd give it a little lower, some people gave it a little higher. It really all depends on what you think of it. I found myself kind of being in the middle of it. The next film I watched, which would be October the 4th, was one of the better films I ended up watching of the week, and that is Hellbound Hellraiser 2. This is the sequel to the original Hellraiser film, which was directed by Clive Barker. This film was not directed by Clive Barker. I believe at the time he was working on the film Nightbreed, which is also a great film. I highly recommend checking that film out as well. But Hellbound Hellraiser 2 is regarded as the best in the series by many horror fans and many Hellraiser fans, at least the ones I've talked to. So I'm just going based on what they said, and I have to agree that I really like this movie a lot. I thought it was better than the first film. It was more ambitious, it was more engrossing. I found myself being more engaged with the film. I found myself really having a great time with it. Granted, the first 50 minutes or first half of the movie partially is a recap of what happened in the first film via, monologues and things like that, just kind of telling us what we already know, giving us a refresher. And we are reintroduced to some of the characters from the first film. It's the same female protagonist from the first film, the same actress. And it wasn't really until the second half of the movie where certain things happen and they go to a certain place that I found myself being really wowed by it. Like, wow, I can't believe they're just going, all out in this film. They're just showing us all kind of the Cenobites and their dimension and kind of all of that, what that world entails. It has a lot of interesting world building. And what I also came to find out is that the movie had a rather tumultuous making of, where the screenplay went through a lot of iterations. The budget for the film kept getting cut down, so that it led to a lot more rewrites and things like that. And what we ended up getting probably was a bastardized version of what the film was originally supposed to be. I believe it was going to be a much larger and much more big budget and ambitious film, but I really enjoyed the product that we got, and I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. Next up, And also, I want to mention these were all first time watches for me. I tried to at least start out the month with filling in the gaps and the holes in my horror viewing history. So these were all brand new to me. And the next one is probably going to be a surprise to some. And this is the film I watched on October 5th, and that is Child's Play, or the first Chucky movie. I had never seen it. Of course, I had heard about it, growing up. I've heard about it for years and years. There've been so many sequels. I believe they're working on a new Chucky movie now, so of course that's in the conversation. But this was a film that apparently many people saw when they were a child, and I didn't actually watch any horror movies when I was a kid. My parents really didn't, let me watch it or were really into horror in any way, so they didn't really show me any of that. But this movie is actually much more of a comedy than it is a horror. It does have a horror premise in the sense that, Chucky is this, murderous doll come to life. If you're not familiar with the premise, basically, um, the a murderer, an escaped murderer, get transports his soul or his identity into this Chucky doll, which they sell to children, and it's a frightening doll in general without being possessed. But this film has a lot of great comedy, especially once the Chucky doll comes to life. And if you're curious, I gave the film a 3.5 out of 5 stars. I enjoyed it. I didn't like it as much as many other people do. Granted, I don't have any nostalgia for it at all, but I did enjoy it a lot. The next film that I watched would be on October 6th, and this is another film that I've been looking to watch for a long time, and that is The Hills Have Eyes, the original from 1977, which was directed by Wes Craven. This is a film that was his second film in his filmography. First one being Last House on the Left, which came out a few years before that. And this film I found to be rather similar to Last House on the Left in the sense that you have these human beings being forced into a situation and being forced to change their identity to adapt to the situation. If you're not familiar with the premise of this film, basically this family is on a trip to California where when their car breaks down in the middle of the desert next to these hills, and it happens to be that cannibals live in these hills, so they are constantly being attacked, and they have to survive against them. And it's a very graphic film. Wes Craven's films, especially his early stuff, tend to be very graphic. Has that 70s grit to them that is rather unique to that time. They could get away with a lot more dirty, a lot more edgier things than I think they could get away with now. Granted, I mean, modern horror gets away with a lot too, but I don't know. It was that grit and that grime and that dirtiness of the 70s just makes it feel that much more icky. Yeah, if you know what I'm talking about, you understand. But this film I thought was really good. I really found myself appreciating it more than I liked it. I think it's something that's going to take a couple more views for me, and it's going to take me really delving deep into kind of like the backstory and the making of which I found to be fantastic. I actually watched it on a new um, Arrow Video Blu-ray that came out a couple of years ago that I picked up, I believe, last Christmas or so. It looked very good. It sounded very good. The acting is okay. It's not great, but granted, when it comes to horror movies, acting is not really paramount. It's more of the scares and it's more of the atmosphere and more of kind of plot type stuff. And I thought this film had a rather engaging plot, and I really liked the ending of this film where it got to. Next up is the final film that I watched, and this would be on October 7th. I'm basically going, every 7 days with this. And this would be James Wan's Insidious, which came out in 2010. I'm, of course, familiar with James Wan's films. I've watched The Conjuring, I've watched The Conjuring 2, I've watched the Fast and Furious movie that he did. I'm very excited for the upcoming Aquaman film. I'm a DC Comics fan, so I'm kind of excited about those films anyway, kind of throwing objectivity out the door. But I think he's overall a great director. I think he does great things with atmosphere and camera work and sound editing, sound design, utilizing a lot of that for tension and using, especially in his films, a lot of slow building, a lot of plotting, and typically in a horror film, people are, really want those scares early, but James Wan really builds up to it. And especially in Insidious, I found it to be a rather patient film, but I also found it to be a really surprisingly enjoyable film from my perspective. I had seen a lot of mixed reviews about it. Kind of some people I've heard, not liking it because it's too slow and because it is essentially a haunted house movie or a haunted movie in general. It takes the haunted house premise and kind of twists it in a few interesting ways, dealing with a lot of interesting, supernatural type horrific events. The film stars a great cast in Patrick Wilson and Rose Byrne, two actors that I think are rather underrated. I really like Patrick Wilson for years now. I think he's a really good actor. And coincidentally, he must have a good relationship with James Wan because he's in both Conjuring films, he's in the sequel to Insidious, and he's going to be in the Aquaman movie. So they must have a great relationship. And I think Rose Byrne is a very versatile, very great actress. I've seen her do great dramatic work, and I've seen her do really great comedic work as well. So Insidious, I found myself really enjoying a lot. If you're not familiar with the premise of it, it's kind of rather straightforward, and you've kind of heard of the premise before. A family moves into a new house, and they start seeing things that go bump in the night. Spirits and people and things walking around, and the son all of a sudden falls into a coma, and he's haunted and all kind of stuff. And it's really interesting the way James Wan mixes and meshes a lot of different genres within his horror films. That's what I really like about it. He doesn't stick to one, cliched horror stuff. He does, mix and match things, and he ends up coming out with a rather unique result. So I'm actually looking forward to probably watching the other Insidious films sometimes during this month. Definitely the sequel. Not quite sure about 3 and 4 because James Wan did not direct those, so I'm kind of less interested in those. But this has been the first week of my horror film kind of 31 Days of Halloween horror movie watch along. And it's been rather interesting. Like I said, I'm slowly filling in the gaps of my horror film cinematic history because there are a few gaps. And horror is not a genre that everybody seems to like. It's a genre that I started out not really liking myself. I thought it was just, a bunch of cliched stuff done over and over again. There's nothing going to be scary, nothing going to be original. But horror is going through a bit of a renaissance now that I found to be very interesting. And it also has a rich history of a lot of good films within it, or at least have got a lot of good genre films within it that I think a lot of people need to be made more aware of and not be so dismissive of the entire genre. Granted, I know people don't like to be scared when it comes to watching their movies. They don't want to be emotionally moved in many ways, but typically frights and scares and things like that are things that people try to avoid. I personally don't mind them. It takes a lot for me to be scared with a lot of these films. None of the films that I watched frightened me in any way this week. I found them to all be just decent films in and of themselves. So, with all that being said, please check out the other videos on my channel. I do plan on doing a couple of more horror related things other than these weekly recaps. I have a few Blu-ray reviews that I want to do. I definitely want to do a Blu-ray review of the Hills Have Eyes Arrow edition that I just talked about. I also have a new Criterion edition of Silence of the Lambs that I want to talk about. That's one of my favorite horror movies of all time. Plus a few other things I want to talk about, perhaps something about Hitchcock as well. He is kind of one of the fathers of the horror genre. Granted, his films are more psychological thrillers, but they still are part of the overall fabric of the horror genre in some sense. You can, split them up if you want to. You can do whatever you want when it comes to movies, but I thought I would kind of delve into those things as well. It's given me a good excuse to talk about Alfred Hitchcock and to talk about a lot of the older horror films that are really staples of the genre in and of themselves. So thanks for tuning in. Hopefully you like this. The picture quality I know is not so great. Hopefully the audio quality is okay and you can hear me, or else this video will be completely wasted. But other than that, I'll see you guys next time.